Right. Good morning, girls. Okay. We're here to look through Non-Sum, a poem by Ernest Dowson. And as we go through the poem, it's my intention that we will look at the comparisons with Gatsby. Okay. Now, starting off, okay. Ernest Dowson, you need to know a little bit about him. I notice he died here in 1900. What's important about him is he's a late Victorian. Now, in terms of this late Victorian movement, he's associated with what we call the decadent movement, or late Romanticism, late Victorianism. He had a real problem with alcohol himself. He had a very tragic life. And like many of the Romantics, the earlier Romantics, Dowson his life ended in failure and not the artistic success that he sought. So the poem really does show this, what we call a fin de siècle, French for end of century feeling, an idea that the times were corrupt and degenerate, an idea that life wasn't really worth living. And so if you look at him, he was associated with people like Swinburne, the English poet, and they often wrote about pretty dark, depressing things. In terms of France, there was also a decadent movement, and that was headed by a very famous poet called Baudelaire. Again, the same kind of themes of the dark failure of life, a real sense of pessimism that comes at the end of the Victorian era. Partly through scientific changes, partly through a belief that religion was disintegrating, and I think also partly through a kind of realization that the Victorian age was a very hypocritical time, and that its morals in many ways were very hypocritical. Now, what's so interesting about this, of course, he calls his lover, his absent lover, Sayonara. And I think that my first comparison that I want to look at is that in Gatsby, myrtle refers to that fleshy shrub, doesn't it, that can exist and survive in arid zones. It gives us a very vivid idea of the surplus flesh of myrtle, doesn't it? So that we associate her with kind of flesh, with body, with sexuality, with a certain kind of vitality. Now, in terms of Sayonara, we don't get that vitality so much, but Sayonara is also a thistly shrub. And that is quite interesting because it is a shrub that was often grown on the temples of Venus, the goddess of love. So in both cases, we have this association of a plant with a woman, but for different reasons. We know, don't we, in Gatsby, that Myrtle is not someone who's going to come back to haunt Tom Buchanan. Far from it. She's temporary sexual satisfaction, isn't she? Whereas in Dowson's poem, the speaker of Dowson's poem, Non sum qualis eram bonae sub regno Sayonara, which translates as, I am not as I was in the days of Sayonara, I think that we can see straight away a real comparison to Gatsby, can't we? Because Gatsby, like the speaker in Non-Sum, wants to go back to this earlier phase, and he associates happiness and any kind of attempt to regain happiness with regaining this particular love. We don't know any of the background story of how they split up. But what we can work out from this poem is that the speaker has indulged in sex with prostitutes, with drunkenness, etc. And he's done so to wipe out and erase all of the pain. Now this, of course, has a connection to Gatsby because in both cases there's a haunting. But interestingly enough, we know that Gatsby leads an incredibly clean life, doesn't he? When finally we get into Gatsby's bedroom, I don't know if you can remember, it's completely bare surfaces and very modest. We never see Gatsby drink, And there's no indication that he's a womanizer. He stays true in his mission to regain Daisy, and he translates all of the energy of his passion into the accumulation of wealth and into kind of designing a narrative of an aristocratic gentleman, which he believes, the high bouncing lover, he believes that Daisy requires. Not so in Non-Sum, as we will see. Last night, yesterday night, betwixt her lips and mine, there fell thy shadow, Sainara. So immediately we get this kind of quiet, meditative, deeply pessimistic, haunted tone. You'll notice that the poem is framed as him speaking to Sainara. Again, it's a monologue which is framed as a dialogue, because obviously we have no reply from her. It's interesting because you'll see that it's a long, what we call Alexandrine 12-syllable line. Very common in French poetry, very rare in English poetry. Again, I think that Dowson may be looking across the water at poets like Baudelaire, who write about sick love and diseased love that corrupts, kills, poisons, that acts like a kind of toxin, which is what's happening here, isn't it? Thy breath was shed upon my soul. Now that's very interesting. We call this synesthesia, don't we? Because breath is from the physical world, soul is from the spiritual world. Synesthesia is when you mix the senses. It's a very important term here. And it's almost as though in the depth of his physicality, she comes to him and she has access to his soul immediately. Again, we feel the sense of absolute corruption here, the sense of dissipation, the kisses and the wine. And I was desolate and sick of old passion. And that is the predominant emotion in this particular poem, this sense of being the slave to an old passion. It's enhanced by the fact that the poet uses éjamment all the way through, but it's a very slow, sluggish rhythm, and the susurras add a kind of sense of rumination and pain, etc. As well as these archaic cries, yea, I was desolate and bowed my head. And then we have the refrain that goes throughout the poem. I have been faithful to thee, Sainara. And you'll notice there the exclamation mark functions as a susurra, and it allows for the end of the phrase, in my fashion. So that qualifying phrase there means, of course, that he has not been faithful at all, in the kind of Gatsby sense of the word, where it would appear that he stayed true to Daisy. In fact, he's more like the scrutiny, that he slept with hundreds of women. You get the idea, don't you? So what does he mean by saying, in my fashion? Well, it would appear, I think, he means that his soul and his heart has never been involved with any of these people. Do you want to add something?
I was going to say, would this be similar to Tom saying, he said something about straying?
My spree. Yes, he goes, I go on my sprees, but I always come back. I think that Tom feels like more of a liar, don't you, than the speaker here? Because the difference between this speaker and Tom is that Tom is a hypocrite. One of the many reasons why we dislike Tom, apart from his brutishness, his patriarchy, his kind of domestic violence, I think is the fact that he is a moral hypocrite. And he constantly says that he disapproves of women gallivanting around. He believes in family values, etc. Yeah? So he's like the kind of Pharisee conservative who does things and then purports to believe in this kind of domestic morality. I think the speaker here of Non-Sum, on the other hand, is not a hypocrite. He's quite forthright with us. And I think that there is quite a lot of self-hatred in his poem, don't you feel? That he understands that his life is wasted and that he's just trying to erase the pain of the present, okay? Now, if we move on quickly. All night upon my heart I felt her warm heart beat. Night long, this compound adjective here. Within my arms in love and sleep she lay. Surely the kisses of her bought mouth were sweet. Now you'll notice here, the clue is her bought mouth, okay? That is the metaphor that explains the relationship. She's a prostitute, isn't she? And those kisses were not really sweet at all, were they? They were sweet because he was deluding himself, was he not? And he was imagining himself in the arms of his true love, Sayonara. But at the same time, he's aware, isn't he, that he's living a kind of fantasy. And that's why the but comes in here, doesn't it? But I was desolate and sick of old passion. And this is about the inadequacy of the delusion, isn't it? Because when it's broken, then he wakes up, doesn't he? I was awoke and found the dawn was grey. Now you notice that we move from the 12-syllable Alexandrine line to the more familiar 10-syllable iambic pentameter. When I awoke and found the dawn was grey. And there's the pathetic fallacy, isn't it? There the dawn, acts as the manifestation of his depression and his sense of absolute, utter desperation and desolation. And again, he speaks to her in the first person, doesn't he? I have forgotten much, Sayonara, gone with the wind. Very famous line used in the movie, isn't it? Flung roses riotously with the throng. And you'll notice here the verb flung, and then the use of the consonant R's right the way through, showing the fact that he's gone on what we could call a kind of a bender, hasn't he? Trying through physicality to get rid of all of the pain of love. With the throng, dancing to put thy pale lost lilies out of mind. So this sensual life, this life of partying and decadence, is one long attempt to get rid of Daisy. So I think it's a good, get rid of Sayonara, sorry. Interestingly, Gatsby has exactly the same thing, doesn't he? He has this obsessive-compulsive disorder. But rather than going to booze or drugs or other women, he directs it into this extraordinary enterprise. And this is why our narrator in Gatsby, Nick, admires him so much. And this is why Nick sees his fantasy as gorgeous and aligns it to the vision of the first founders of the United States, yeah? Although I use that term founders ironically, because I think obviously Native Americans had found their own country, hadn't they? And the lily is interesting. That's a direct connection, as I say here, to La Belle Dame sans merci. And of course, the lily is the flower of death, isn't it? So in both cases, love is associated with a kind of slow-working poison, isn't it? That intoxicates you, makes you feverish, sucks your health, invades you, so that it becomes like a kind of heroin, doesn't it, in both these cases, yeah? With Gatsby, it doesn't suck his health away, does it? It gives him a tremendous energy and vision, and that seems to be the difference. So in both cases, you have your male characters haunted by the women, but in the case of Daisy, she seems to inspire Gatsby to great action, to energy, to vitality, to being a kind of god. Do you remember? He sees himself as a protean self, so a self that's able to make himself. godlike, yeah? Whereas you can see quite the opposite with our narrator of non-sum here. He feels that he is dying, doesn't he? This long drawn out death. And again, part of the power, I think, of this poem is this very depressing refrain. I have been faithful to thee, Sainara, in my fashion. And it's the in my fashion which is quite tragic, isn't it? I cried for madder music and for stronger wine. So again, we see this attempt to drown out the passions and to erase all of this terrible memory, this traumatic memory for him. Now, what is quite interesting is that some of you may recall, and I'll write it down here just to remind you, that at one stage, Fitzgerald was going to call Gatsby Trimalchio. Can anyone remember that?
Yeah.
And Trimalchio was a Greek party boy who was nouveau riche, who'd been given money and spent it very garishly. So I think we can see that in that sense, Gatsby could be seen as a Trimalchio. But Trimalchio himself was a drinker and someone who engaged in serial sex with women. And what's interesting is at some point, Fitzgerald changed Gatsby's characterization and decided to make him like Trimalchio in the sense of spending huge and vast amounts of money on great big parties. But the thing that distinguishes Gatsby is his separateness from the parties, don't you feel? And that is right from the start, when Nick first sees him, stretching his hand out to the green light. Gatsby is curiously and tragically alone, is he not? And when he appears at his parties, he appears as an observer, doesn't he? And not as a participant. So again, I want you to see the contrast then with non-sum. Here we have the speaker who throws himself into the party as a distraction, doesn't he? He tries to get giddy. He wants stronger drink. He wants to annihilate the senses. In a sense, he seeks death, doesn't he? The annihilation of pain. As I say, I think the major contrast then with Gatsby is that Gatsby does not in any way seek to dislodge Daisy's memory. In fact, he cultivates it and he makes it his mission, as symbolized by stretching out to the green light, where he tries to hold her and possess her. We don't know what happened in non-sum. That's the mystery of the poem, isn't it? Why did they split up? Did she die? Did she reject him? Were they unable to be together? We don't know. But what we do know is that he never recovered. But when the feast is finished and the lamps expire, so again, what we are reminded of here is when you try to throw yourself into a sensual life, a life of debauchery, that it's always temporary and it ends. We saw earlier, didn't we, the coming of the grey dawn. And we see now, don't we, that the dance ends. And we see that the lamps expire. And when that happens, then you have to live in reality. Now, can we think about how that connects to Gatsby? I think it connects in this way, that Gatsby has this huge energy, doesn't he? He creates this wealth. He has this vast house, this chateau, that's based on a chateau from France. He has the shirts flown in, the hundreds of shirts, from the most expensive Savile Row tailors in London. He has the books, the first editions. He has the gigantic organ. He possesses all of this. And he does so because it makes him feel as though he's on a path, on a mission to get Daisy. But there is a time, isn't there, in that hotel room in New York, where it comes crashing down on him, where his mission to regain the past, and to erase all of that time where it appears that he too sees that the dawn is there great for him as well. And that this mission to regain her, and not only regain her, because that's the key thing, isn't it? It's not sufficient to possess her in the present. He wants to go back to the past and to possess her there, and to erase Tom, to raise the baby and everything. Yeah.
And linked to time as well. So at the time of the tyrant.
Very much links to time, and I think it would link to Sonnet 116, wouldn't it? Where again Shakespeare sees love as conquering time, as being eternal, as overcoming time. And Gatsby shares that beautiful spiritual platonic conception of love, doesn't he? That if you love strong enough, you can actually overcome time. And you'll recall that Nick is so surprised when he goes, you can't go back in time, doesn't he? You can't go back to the past. And Gatsby says, of course you can, showing this extraordinary idealism.
Did you say that the poem is slightly different, as in the speaker's use time is kind of a burden? Because the more time he spends away from the one he loves, the more he suffers?
Yes, in this case, time is very much a burden, isn't it? And but there is one thing that it shares with Gatsby, which is that time doesn't kill the passion in this poem as well, doesn't it? But it doesn't have the idealism of Gatsby's poem. This is more like time as a slow-working poison, and his inability to find any kind of antidote or escape from it, yeah? The madder music, everything fails, doesn't it? Then falls thy shadow, and she's pictured as a shadow, which gives her, again, a ghostly, supernatural sense, which I think is quite reminiscent of the ghostly green light. And we said before, didn't we, in that first scene, when Gatsby stretches out his hand towards the green light, there's something quite gothic about that, isn't there? And I am desolate and sick of old passion. So again, we have this repetition of that line, which shows us, doesn't it, that this is a familiar pattern that has gone over perhaps even decades. The madness of the intoxication, the bought kisses, it's a pattern, and it's a pattern of self-punishment and the inability to escape. Yea, hungry for the lips of my desire. Here again, perhaps another contrast would be the fact that Gatsby doesn't seem to want to possess Daisy in this kind of sexual way. He doesn't seem to. It's more that she is a kind of Daisy Fay figure, isn't it? Which has a magical property for him. That she is like Rapunzel, the girl at the top of the tower, isn't she? Someone that you want to climb up and possess. I have been faithful to thee, Sinara, in my fashion. Okay? So, I think I'm going to stop there and talk about the fact that this was a really interesting idea, wasn't it? That in Gatsby, he also never recovers. With the first kiss, she blossomed for him like a flower. Do you recall that? And a kind of swag word there would be blossomed, wouldn't it? Which is rich and redolent with this idea of growing and fertility, etc. And it would appear that Sinara also blossomed for our speaker here. That her lips was something that he could never forget. But interestingly, another quote that I want you to remember from Gatsby was that Daisy tumbled short of his dreams. Nick says this during the height of their affair. Do you remember? When they send all the servants away and they're together and they're in love. But Nick feels that Gatsby must have had some kind of sneaking awareness that Daisy wasn't the product that he wanted her to be. And I love the verb there, tumbled, as though they're running and she falls, doesn't she? Because it suggests this kind of awkwardness. It's everything that would be the antithesis of his dream of harmony and them being together. So there's a big link between these two poems. Both of them representing love as a haunting, love as a kind of poison. But as I said, very big differences in terms of the way the male protagonists deal with this haunting. One wants to recreate his whole narrative. It energizes him. It turns him into Jay Gatsby, doesn't it? The officer from Oxford, the young Raja who goes around Europe hunting and looking for rubies, etc. And the very different reaction from Dowson, writing within this fin de siècle ennui idea of life, that everything is sick and lost, slow and poisoned, dull and sluggish. So very, very different reactions, okay? I'll just stop it there.